Today we're going to talk about Chinese, different varieties of Chinese. I have a language blog that I started about 1.5 years ago, and as far as China goes, on there I have a few articles about non-Chinese languages that are spoken in China, but soon I want to start putting some things on about Sichuanese and maybe some other Chinese languages. So today we're going to talk about so-called dialects and why this is a bit of a misnomer, and there's some problems with this term. We'll talk a little bit about historical context and development of different varieties of Chinese, and then we'll get into a couple specific languages like Sichuanese, Shanghainese, and if we have a little bit of time, maybe Hakka. Zooming out a bit for a second, we'll take a look at the linguistic map of China. So everything you see in red on the map is considered a variety of Chinese. Everything else are languages from different families. There are Tibetan languages spoken, Turkic languages, Thai languages. So China is actually a very linguistically diverse country. Coloring everything here in red, though, is also misleading because everything there in red includes countless varieties of Chinese that are all called Chinese, but from even one village to the next can be mutually unintelligible. So the diversity is quite remarkable. We'll start with this word, fangyan. So in Mandarin, the word fangyan is generally translated as dialect. Fangyan referred to regional languages. You can basically take the name of any place and put the word hua at the end of it for speech, and you have a fangyan. It's made up of the words fang for place and yan, which is basically speech. So like I said, it's often translated as dialect. I think probably regional language is a more accurate translation a lot of the time. Yesterday, Mike Campbell mentioned the word topolect, which gives the implication that the language or the language variety is linked to a certain place. So I think that's also a good translation. Now, when we talk about different dialects of Chinese or different Chinese languages, usually we're limited to Mandarin or Cantonese. When someone decides to learn Chinese, they often encounter the question, do I learn Mandarin or Cantonese? Or often when I tell people I speak Chinese, that's the question I get, Mandarin or Cantonese. And so there's a couple reasons why these two languages have such a high profile. So for Mandarin, it's spoken in the People's Republic of China and Taiwan as the national language. It's also spoken by many overseas Chinese communities, and altogether it has about 850 to 950 million native speakers. Total speakers is over 1 billion, so it's a serious language. Cantonese, on the other hand, it has only about 60 to 80 million native speakers, but it's spoken in Hong Kong and Macau, and there it's used in all levels of society, so government, education, business, everything. So it's also a very high-profile language. It appears in the media a lot, and a lot of long-established overseas Chinese communities, particularly in the Americas and Europe, have been Cantonese-speaking. So Cantonese has a long history of contact with the West. China's a lot more diverse than that, though, and Chinese is a lot more diverse. And so in order to start to understand how to break down all of these different varieties of Chinese and categories, I think it's good to start with the north-south split. So in China, there's definitely a cultural split between the north and the south that's often talked about, and this is also a linguistic split. So in this map, everything in red is considered a variety of Mandarin, linguistically anyway, and everything in the south is considered a southern Chinese language. These southern Chinese languages, however, are very different from each other, mutually unintelligible, have different histories, have developed different phonologies. So you have the situation where there's a little bit more uniformity in the north, and then in the south you have extreme variety. This map's a little bit more accurate, and it gives the Chinese names for the different dialects or different language groups. You'll notice in the north, there's this orange blob, which is for the Jin language. And the Jin language was originally considered to be a variety of Mandarin, but in the past couple decades, because of some preserved phonological characteristics from Middle Chinese, it's been shown to be its own Chinese language. And this relationship between Jin and Middle Chinese also speaks towards how the Southern Chinese languages developed as well. So to sum up like 2,000 years of Chinese history in one slide, which is really hard to do, the short story essentially is that the Southern Chinese languages resulted from southward migrations throughout Chinese history, basically. So you had people living in the Central Plains in northern China, and because of war or political persecution or various reasons, natural disaster, people moved southwards. And when they came south with them, they brought their variety of Middle Chinese. So Middle Chinese was quite a bit more uniform than the situation of Chinese today. So people brought with them their language, and in the south, the land tends to be a bit more difficult to navigate, it's more mountainous, communities become more isolated, and so you have a lot of languages that developed out of a crystallization of Middle Chinese characteristics, followed by influence from indigenous languages in the area, and then also just independent development and innovation over the next 1,000 years or so. Minyu, so you might know it as Hokkien or Fukienese or Taiwanese. Those are all varieties of Min. Min split from the rest of Chinese, they think in the Han Dynasty, so that would have been Old Chinese, whereas all the other languages made the split more in the Sui and Tang dynasties, and that would have been Middle Chinese. And you still can see today that Min languages tend to be phonologically more divergent. So let's see. There's an expression in Chinese, 天高皇帝远, which means the heaven is high above and the emperor is far away. This basically describes a situation where the central government has little to no influence over far and remote places. So this is often a phrase used when talking about the development of Southern Chinese languages. In more isolated places, they sort of did their own thing. They didn't let the influence of Imperial Mandarin change their language too much. And so we have another map that gives a pretty complete picture. Something else that you have to talk about when you talk about Chinese is the difference between the written and the spoken language. So we have two characters here, wen and hua. So wen refers to written language, and hua refers more to spoken language. Dialects, so-called dialects, are always referred to with hua. So Cantonese is Guangdong Hua, for example. Whereas the written language is always referred to as wen, zhongwen. And throughout Chinese history into the 20th century, people continued to write in basically Tang Dynasty Chinese, classical Chinese. And that was considered, in most contexts, to be the only acceptable written language. So even after the Southern Chinese languages developed and diverged, people still wrote using Tang Dynasty grammar and vocabulary. In what's called literary classical Chinese. Sometime in we'll move forward, in the Ming and Qing dynasties, the central government decided that they needed a way to communicate with the whole country. They needed a common spoken language. And so they developed Guanhua. Guanhua is the term for Mandarin. It comes from the word guan, which is like an official, a government official, and then hua, speech. So this was the language that all government officials had to learn. They would go out into the empire, do their business, and basically this spread Mandarin a bit more and created a little more uniformity for Mandarin in the north. But Guanghua is not totally uniform. This map shows different dialects of Guanghua, and I would say that there's more mutual intelligibility than the southern languages, but not totally. So if we put everything together with the dialects in the north and then the languages in the south, then this map is probably the best map that I found that gives a full picture. So suddenly everything that was colored in red on the other map, just as Chinese, is starting to look quite different. So there's this other word, 普通话. 普通话 is a more modern word for Mandarin, and it refers basically to standard Mandarin based on the Beijing dialect or northeastern speech. And so you have this photo from a school in Sichuan where supposedly it's a Mandarin-speaking province, but you have this photo hanging on the school wall saying 请说普通话, please speak Mandarin. So in this Mandarin-speaking place, you have to remind people to speak Mandarin. So it's just a demonstration of how the term Mandarin is not really so clear.
Maybe students from other provinces?
No, local students would speak something that would be totally different from standard Mandarin. It's about the standard version of the language. So we're going to move to Sichuan. I lived in Sichuan for a year, and I really fell in love with the language there. Sichuanese is spoken in both Sichuan and Chongqing. It's a variety of Southwestern Mandarin, but it's only partially intelligible with standard Mandarin. And I'm not really sure about this figure, but I found something that said there's perhaps 100 million native speakers if you count it as separate from other varieties of Mandarin. Sichuanese itself has dialects. I've pretty much been around most of the province, and I would say that this map shows more accurately a dialect situation. You can pretty much understand everyone around the province. There's some differences here and there, but they seem to be dialects, whereas Sichuanese by itself, I'm tempted to just call it a language. So, 四川话为啥子是北方方言? Why is Sichuanese a northern dialect if it is in the south? So originally there was Old Sichuanese, which split from Old Chinese, probably around the Han Dynasty as well. But that language became extinct due to natural disaster and population decline, and there was a mass influx of people from Hubei, and they were Southwestern Mandarin speakers. So that really set the ground for what we know as modern Sichuanese, and that's how Mandarin became transplanted as a native language in the southern region. Sichuanese phonologically is not all that different from Mandarin. Most words sound relatively the same, but the tones are completely different. So for those of you who have studied Chinese, you know the tone values. So 5 is a high tone, all the way down to 1, which is a low tone. What you have here are the phonetic values for different tones. And if that doesn't make too much sense to you, you can just notice that the numbers are totally different. So what that essentially looks like is that you have a language that the phonemes sound pretty close to standard Mandarin, to this other language, but the tones, which are also phonemic, are totally off. So it completely it makes it very difficult to understand if you're not used to it. So this site, Phonemica, is a really great site to go on. You can find people that have recorded themselves speaking in all sorts of Chinese languages. And I'm going to play one from someone in Chengdu.
大家好，我从小就生活在成都，但我的老家其实是在乐山。我5、6岁的时候就来到了成都，对这儿呢有很深的感情。记得刚到成都的时候，为了融入当地的环境，鼓捣自己学成都话。那个时候第一句学到的就是一句骂人的话，叫“瓜娃子”。这个词呢，基本上属于成都市的市骂，流传得相当广。我想说的是，推广普通话以来呢，成都话已经有被普通话同化的倾向。很多年。
So I'd like to ask any Mandarin speakers how accessible? Do you find that you? Yes, there's a lot of things in Sichuanese that resemble like a southern accent in Mandarin. Yep. So this is basically what Sichuanese sounds like. We'll take a look at some examples. So a common greeting in all varieties of Chinese is just to ask if you've eaten. So in Sichuanese, this would be 你吃饭了没得? Compared to Mandarin, 你吃饭了没有? So 你吃饭了没得? The words are not that different, but if you're not expecting it, it would catch you off guard. Do you know in Sichuanese would be 你晓得不? Compared to 你知道吗? I can speak Sichuanese would be 我说得来四川话. Compared to 我会说四川话. So you can hear that the intonation, the individual tones of all the words are totally different. The above sentence written is perfectly understandable to anyone that can read Chinese. You just wouldn't really say it that way. Oh geez, this got all messed up somehow. Anyway, so some common phrases in Sichuanese. 没得事 is 没事. Or 不得行 is 不行. They use de or de a lot. 安逸 is used for 舒服. 巴士 is a uniquely Sichuanese word. It means delicious or good or anything positive. And some people think it comes from old Sichuanese. 瓜娃子 is a way to call someone an idiot, basically. Lago is used instead of 谁 for who. 傻子 is instead of 什么 for what. And 好嘛 instead of 好吧. So this ma, this like emphatic ma, is used very casually in Sichuanese. Let's see, we have a video of a pop star that comes from Sichuan. She's going to introduce herself in Mandarin and then give an example of Sichuanese. And she's focusing on yu qi modal particles, so these little words that you put at the end of a sentence that kind of give the sentence a certain flavor. And they're very different in Sichuanese.
Hello， 大家好，我是张靓颖。都说我们四川话非常有味道，但最重要的往往是一句话的最后一个语气词。要不要感受一下呢？比如说，你真的记不到我了嗦？我是你幼儿园的同学的嘛。下周星期六我的生日，一起去吃火锅噻，莫客气哈。不要客气哈。你记得给我打电话噻，一定要来哦。回家过年只说方言。大家好，我是张靓颖，祝大家新年快乐，万事如意。四川的亲们，一家老小向前冲。
万事如意。So that's Sichuanese. And on my blog, I'm going to start putting some basic materials for learning the basics of Sichuanese, because it doesn't really exist anywhere. So moving on to another variety of Chinese that is quite different, we're going to start looking at a kind of Wu Chinese, which you'll find in this blue area. Specifically, we're going to look at Shanghainese, which is a dialect specific to the city of Shanghai. So Shanghainese is really only spoken in and around Shanghai. It's kind of the prestige variety of Wu nowadays because of the prestige of the city itself. It's mutually unintelligible with Mandarin, pretty much. You can pick out some things, but it's quite different. And it has about 14 million speakers. It seems like a good number of speakers, but actually the situation with Shanghainese is under a lot of pressure because of Mandarin-only policy. So if you look at the young generations right now, the quality of the Sichuanese, or the Shanghainese that they speak, is suffering under the influence of Mandarin. So a lot of people are worried about that. This I can play over here, just a little sample.
侬第一次来上海，想到啥地方去白相相？
侬看呢？ 我不晓得上海啥地方好白相，听侬介绍介绍好伐？
侬对啥个物事最感兴趣个？讲讲看。
读书人嘛，最欢喜个就是文化咯，总归搭文化有关就可以了。
哦，葛末阿拉先到上海博物馆去。
Okay, so Mandarin speakers, how accessible do you find this or understandable? What's that? Much harder. Yeah, it has a very divergent history from Mandarin. What about Cantonese speakers? Any more easy to understand? Yeah. Yeah, I would say so as well. That she's from Shanghai, and she says she doesn't find Cantonese understandable. They're not mutually intelligible at all. So Shanghainese preserves many phonological characteristics of Middle Chinese. It's one of the few varieties that has preserved voiced consonants. Middle Chinese had a distinction between voiced and unvoiced consonants, which has pretty much disappeared except in some Wu varieties. It has different tone registers, so tones with similar contours in a high and a low register. And it also preserves the entering tone, or 入声, which basically is a checked tone that ends in a glottal stop or an unreleased k sound. Something really interesting with Shanghainese is that it has a really particular tone sandhi. So tone sandhi basically is when the inherent tone of a word changes given the environment that it's in, what other words or tones it's next to. So in Mandarin, you're probably familiar, if you know Mandarin, with two third tones next to each other. The first one generally becomes the second tone. In Shanghainese, though, you get a tone contour over an entire phrase. So, and this contour differs slightly if it's a 2-character phrase or a 3 or 4 or 5-character phrase. And the contour is based on the inherent tone of the first character in the phrase. So what that means, I think it's easiest to look at an example. So if we see the word here, zong, it's a 1-3 tone. If we're going to put it in a 2-character phrase to say Shanghai, which is zhanghe, then you have a low tone on the first word and then a higher tone on the second one, zhanghe. If we want to add a third word next below and say a Shanghai person, then it's zhanghe ning. And then if you want to have a 4-character phrase, so Shanghai hotel would be zhanghe binggu. And then adding another one inside the Shanghai hotel, zhanghe binggu li. So the pattern is that the tone starts low, goes high, and then gradually decreases. And this is all just determined by the tone of the first word. So any phrase beginning with a word with that tone will have the same pattern. It's a very particular thing to Shanghainese. So we'll look at some sentences. So have you eaten? 农匪吃过了吧? Compared to the Mandarin, 你吃饭了没有? So it's starting to look a little more different. I can speak Shanghainese. 我会讲上海话. Or 我会说上海话. So again, the written, you can understand what it says. You wouldn't really say it that way in Mandarin. But then when you say it out loud, the phonology is totally different. So it renders it unintelligible. And then something even more different, ala qibashang would be, we're going to have fun. Compared to Mandarin, 我们去玩. So 去 is really the only word in common there. And you'll find in different southern varieties of Chinese, often pronouns like this ala are quite different. Pronouns often got preserved from an earlier version of Chinese. Sorry about the formatting on this. Anyway, some more phrases. Valese is 不行, or instead of saying 再见, you say 这位. instead of 什么时候撒增广. 这儿 would be get that. And then I guess you can't see at the bottom 很多钱 would be 交贵钞票. Something like that. Sorry for my pronunciation. How are we doing on time?
It's now 25 here.
Oh, excellent. Okay. So just to finish up, we'll talk a little bit about Hakka as well. I don't actually know that much about Hakka, but I've just started to kind of investigate it and learn a little bit of it. So yeah, I wanted to throw that in for fun. Hakka is interesting in that it's not spoken in one single area. It's actually spoken in isolated areas throughout southern China and Taiwan. Even as far west as Sichuan, you can also find Hakka speakers. And so this is the result of many southward and westward migrations over time. The difference with the Hakka is that they migrated at a later time. So when they arrived, they were already coming to areas that were populated. They were labeled Hakka, which means guest families. And so basically they were labeled outsiders from the beginning. And so particularly in northern Guangdong, a lot of Hakka lived in these kind of houses that were built that way for protection. And so you can kind of see physically how tight-knit these communities were and were able to preserve this language. Hakka were also kind of had to live on land that wasn't already occupied, so they often lived in like mountainous areas or on land that wasn't very fertile, so that also added to their isolation. So I'm going to play just a little sample from a language course. So you're going to hear first a sentence in Hakka and then the translation in Mandarin.
日要的够好发么？你会讲客家话吗？我要讲一些的好话。我会讲一点点客家话。我唔要讲好话。我不会讲客家话。要给好话用嚟讲。
Oops. Okay. So yeah, that's Hakka. So back to the question, why languages instead of dialects? Well, as you can see, there's often a complete lack of mutual intelligibility, so it would just make sense more to consider these languages. But more importantly than that, there are centuries of independent spoken development. Even though all these languages were united under a written form, that written form was really a separate language. That was an archaic language with its own grammar and vocabulary. So these languages have been developing for centuries on their own. I also think it's important to recognize that calling something a language gives it a certain level of prestige. And in a country like China, where there's a Mandarin-only policy, it's really hurting the situation of so-called dialects. Luckily, these languages have millions and millions of speakers, so I feel like there's actually some time to do something about this situation. But I think you need to start recognizing them as languages in their own right. I also really like to see dialects in written form. I think that that really adds a lot of prestige to it, and Cantonese has been the most successful dialect in that respect, and there are a lot of characters that have been created or like revived from Old Chinese in order to accommodate words in Cantonese that don't exist in Mandarin. And so you can find, well, certainly advertisements, comic books, sometimes novels written in dialect form of written Chinese. So I would love to see that happen more. And then also, these aren't just languages, they also come with cultural identities as well. So every language pretty much comes with a cuisine and a regional history and a culture of its own. So I think that something gets a bit lost when you start to you start to live or access all of these different cultures through the medium of Beijing-appointed standard Mandarin. It sort of takes a little something away from it. So yeah, thank you. A little formatting problem there. And yeah, we have a good amount of time for questions, so.
Yeah, I wonder if you could comment on an observation that I've had. As you probably know, in the case of Vietnamese, Korean, and Japanese, over 50% of the vocabulary is of Sino origin. But what I've noticed is that the transformation in the pronunciation seems closer to like Cantonese or Minhua, like Jehun, like a J becomes a K, so does the H sometimes, the Kekong, Kekong Hada, Kekong Suru, and so on. And they're slightly different between Vietnamese and Japanese. I teach in Japan, management in Japanese, and my students, I have students from Korea, Vietnam, and China, and they can relate to a lot of the Japanese pronunciation much easier than they can the original Chinese.
Yeah, absolutely. And that basically comes from the time when those words were brought over to Japan. Why? Because the southern languages reflect more of a Middle Chinese pronunciation. So in terms of phonology, a lot of the southern languages were more conservative. They preserved.
Which would be close to Cantonese or Vietnam?
I'm gonna say Cantonese because Minyu has a lot of different things going on. But yeah, there's a lot of examples. So I don't know, like Toshokan in Japanese for library. In Cantonese is Tosukun versus like Tushuguan, which is a little different in Mandarin. So yeah, you often see that. And then somebody gave a talk a couple of years ago, I think, about how Cantonese is like the key to languages with a Sinitic vocabulary because of this very reason. So that's on YouTube somewhere. Yeah. 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 Anybody else? Yeah.
Hey, so I know it's a huge question, but is getting people, a community to use the written language more in just within their social circles, is that a matter only of policy, recognizing one of these dialects as an official language? For example, in Taiwan, most native speakers can't read or write using characters or even romanization. So how can we get people to start using this in society and to start reading comics that just like something that's possible in Hong Kong, right? So.
I think well, the thing about dialect characters is that they're not just arbitrarily made up. They do come from somewhere. They have a phonetic element that makes sense. They often have a semantic element as well that makes sense. And so, like for me, when I see something written in Cantonese or in Shanghainese, often I didn't know the character until I saw it. It made sense to me. And so I think advertising actually is a really good place, a really smart place to use it, because it's where people see it, you know the context of the ad, you know what it's saying, and so when you see the character and it makes sense to you, you can see the phonetic and how it's built together, it will sort of stick in your head. And I think that's probably one way that Cantonese has spread the use of written dialect. To really have it like widespread and standardized, you would have to have it through the education system. In China, this is just not going to happen. So yeah, I think that I think that we need more of like a paradigm shift of actually giving the respect due to the language, and getting people to realize that you actually can write this. It's not impossible to write. You just have to, you know, use the tools that you have to create Chinese characters and you know, apply them. So, and sometimes people will use characters that mean something totally different, but it has the correct sound. So it looks a little weird, but if you read it out loud, you can make sense of it. So. Yeah, I mean, publishing and advertisement, I would say. Yeah, otherwise I would say education, but I don't think you can rely on that. Yeah.
Just a quick thing. Actually, I have a friend, an artist from Hong Kong, who I met in Taiwan whilst we were studying together in the art university there. And he has actually created as his artwork a phonological system of characters for Cantonese. And yeah, and his works are exhibited right now in Taiwan and also will be exhibited in Hong Kong. And it's very interesting. So I don't know, I might be later like coming to you and like I can show you this website of his. Yeah.
That would be great, and that's a perfect example of what can be done to spread the use of characters. Actually, if you're on the event Facebook group, maybe you could post that link.
Well, first of all, thank you, Timothy. Great talk. Yeah, I would like to ask you about your experience learning some of the dialects, especially when it comes to resources. I know that the prestige dialects as Cantonese and a little bit Shanghainese, there's material out in the market in China, but others, it's really difficult to get your hand on something to actually learn it as a foreigner or even as a local.
That was definitely the situation with Sichuanese when I got to Sichuan and really decided I wanted to learn it. The only thing I could find was a book for Sichuan teachers to speak Mandarin properly, and it had you know, obviously no phonetics for the Sichuanese part. It only had standard pinyin, and so I used it a bit for vocabulary, but it wasn't really very useful. Basically, I sat friends down and you know, for 20 minutes at a time just wrote word lists. How do you say this? How do you say this? And I looked for patterns. And at that time, I couldn't find any information on the tones in Sichuanese. I don't know if it was like blocked or if the wiki page hadn't been made yet or what, but I knew there was a pattern basically, and so I tried to find what the pattern was. I figured it out pretty closely, but there were some things that didn't fit, and I found out later on that this is because the entering tone of Middle Chinese, it converged with the second tone. And that wasn't obvious to me as a Mandarin speaker, but when I thought about all those words that were this strange tone in Sichuanese, and I thought, how do you say those in Cantonese? They're all entering tone. So there's a system, and I think this applies to most Chinese languages. Like these developments and sound changes were all systematic. So you can start there. And then, yeah, local vocab will be a little bit different. I think actually learning classical Chinese is very helpful as well, particularly for vocab. You find a lot of older terms in local languages. So, yeah.
Maybe I have a short question.
Okay.
How much is television, radio, or cinema? Wait for the... Okay. How much is television, radio, and cinema a threat for the local languages and dialects, or do they have some local media like television or radio?
There is some TV. For Cantonese, it's different. You can find anything in Cantonese because of, you know, a lot of things come out of Hong Kong. But like for Sichuanese, for instance, there may be like couple hours a week, you could find a show in Sichuanese. Usually it's like a skit performance show or something like that. You can find Sichuanese opera, local opera all over the country you can find in the dialect. It's a bit tedious to watch if you're not into it, but radio, I never really heard much Sichuanese on the radio. I know you can hear it in Shanghai sometimes, TV sometimes as well in Shanghai, is that right?
Okay. Well, I want to say thank you as well for a very interesting talk, because it was quite informative for me as well, because it's my native tongue, Shanghainese, so I never had to learn it and never really understood the whole toning thing. That was really interesting. Thank you. Well, it's actually a subject I feel really, really strongly about, dialects and my own dialect, and the fact that my cousins don't speak Shanghainese properly drives me crazy. But anyway, yes, in Shanghai, so my grandparents once said, do not speak Mandarin, and they watch TV in Shanghainese all day. So I'm pretty sure there's Shanghainese TV. I was quite surprised myself. But going back to the whole Mandarin policy thing as well, so I noticed that in recent years, they've actually started promoting Shanghainese again. I don't know how recent you've been there. So like in buses and stuff, they've started announcing the stops, etc. in Shanghainese. However, when I was there this year, all that stopped again, so I don't really know. But even though we have 14 million speakers, from what I see, the rate it's going, the rate that I guess the youth are now kind of thinking it's more, I guess, acceptable to speak Mandarin rather than Shanghainese. I'm actually quite scared about the future of Shanghainese. So even though they are 14 million speakers, I would say that in a few generations it might disappear. I mean, no questions, my kids will speak Shanghainese, but I don't know. It's got to be, as you say, it needs to be. I don't know. Maybe it can be seen as more prestigious if it was made like an official, like a proper language. Then there's maybe more of a chance of survival. But at the rate that it's going right now, I don't know. It's just my family, sometimes they switch, or the younger generation, they switch to Mandarin, and I force them to speak Shanghainese to me. But otherwise, yeah.
Yeah, I found something on YouTube that was someone that grew up in the States, I believe, speaking Shanghainese at home, and that's the only kind of Chinese he spoke, and went back to Shanghai and actually had a really hard time getting around because he couldn't find enough, speakers everywhere. So,
My friends of my generation, they all speak Mandarin amongst themselves.
Yeah.
I was surprised you guys don't speak Shanghainese anymore.
Yeah, and when it's generational like that, it's like quite a dangerous situation. 14 million or not, but yeah.
This is not a question. I just I can give some information for my own dialect. I speak Teochew, which is Chaozhouhua in Mandarin. Actually, we do have some learning material, but you need to speak first Mandarin. And if you want to look at it, it's Chaozhouhua Sanyue Tong. And there's a lot of this. You also have this Shanghai-hua Sanyue Tong. So you can look at on internet, and also for Teochew Wei. Sorry, I'm mixing both. For Teochew Wei, you can also, there's an app on, I guess, iPhone, and there is with a list of vocabulary of 4,000 words in English and Teochew, Romanized Teochew with the Chinese character, and actually. I participated in this project, but it was like 10 or 15 years ago. But it just came out like few years ago, and in my point of view, there are some mistakes. There were some debates because we needed to be. We gathered a group of 4 people to make this list, and it was kind of difficult because everyone has a different background, because Teochew is spoken in Southeast Asia, so you have people from Vietnam, from Thailand, from Cambodia, and also we were all split around the world, so there was someone from the US, I'm from France, there was someone from New Zealand, so finding a time slot to be all together was very hard, but I guess it was worth it, and I just want to share this information that there is this application.
Oh, okay.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you, everybody. And I do have some resources and things I can refer to anyone if you're interested in learning different dialects.